Exclusive insights, actionable strategies, and ideas that ignite change. You're listening to the Ivey Impact Podcast from Ivey Business School.
Hello, and welcome to Dialogue with the Dean, the inaugural series on the Ivey Impact Podcast. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, Dean of the Ivey Business School. On today's episode, we're plugging into the rapidly evolving world of electric vehicles. Once seen as a futuristic novelty, EVs are now at the centre of national policy, consumer debate, and industrial strategy. But despite growing interest, Canada still faces big questions about infrastructure, affordability, and how to turn policy promises into real progress on the road. To help us navigate this electric moment is Gal Raz, a Professor of Operations and Sustainability and a Fellow at the Lawrence National Centre for Policy and Management. Gal's work explores the intersection of innovation, supply chains, and sustainable business, making him the perfect guide to unpack the challenges and opportunities of EV adoption. Gal, welcome to Dialogue with the Dean. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Julian. It's a pleasure.
Great. So just before we get into EVs and your own research, just briefly, how did you end up at Ivey? What's your background?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. I'm a bit of a global citizen, if you will. I mean, I kind of, I'm originally from Israel. I then kind of, I grew up, I did my undergrad there, and then I went to do my PhD in operations and a master's in public policy in Stanford University. And from there, I went to Sydney, Australia, I spent about 5 years in the AGSM, the Australian Graduate School of Management. And then I went to University of Virginia, Darden Business School, where I spent about 8 years. And I think I really got captured by the case method. I'm a huge kind of proponent of the case method, both the teaching, but also the interaction between teaching and research. I've done a lot of cases that turned into research, and I really enjoyed that. And then I joined, in 2015, I joined Ivey. I've been here for since 10 years and teaching operations, sustainability, supply chain, and spending a few years in the dean's office also until a year ago.
Wow. So that's quite an impressive bit of globetrotting there. So we'll talk about electric vehicles, EVs. Canada, of course, has committed to a bold zero-emission mandate. By 2026, 20% of passenger cars and light trucks sold must be zero-emission vehicles, rising to 100% by 2035. So how is Canada doing on that set of targets?
So I think the last year have been generally good if you're looking kind of, the advance, but I don't think still not good enough probably, but going in the right direction. So we got to about 15% almost of EVs. We still have kind of a way to go in 2025 and kind of getting into 2026. I think that overall you've seen a quite big investment of the Canadian government, both federal and in the different provinces, in the supply side of EVs. So you've kind of seen, and we might talk a bit more in detail, investment in Honda, Stellantis, Ford investing in Quebec, a lot of different companies. But at the same time, I think on the demand side, we're still having challenges. And I think what's been happening recently of the government taking reducing some rebates in different provinces in Quebec and in BC, and also kind of the federal rebate being taken down. That's not helpful. So I think there's still a lot of roadblocks around the demand side that we can talk more about.
So roadblocks on the demand side, meaning people like you and me are simply not choosing to buy EVs. And I only moved to Canada 6 months ago, and I did not buy an EV, even though I had one in the UK before I left. I was a bit worried about the classic problem of range anxiety. I was a bit worried about would there be enough charging stations. Is that normal? I mean, is that the biggest block at the moment?
I would say there's two biggest blocks. I mean, still prices of EVs, if you compare them to kind of, other cars, so similar cars basically that are gasoline powered, as well as the range anxiety are probably the biggest kind of, issues. And specifically, I mean, you touched on charging. I think charging is a really big issue, both the public charging, but also the private charging. So people charging at home and kind of, offices is still a big issue.
Right. And is the charging station rollout happening as per plan? Because obviously there's two models there. One is in a public investment, government push, and another is you wait for private sector companies. How's that happening?
So I would say, definitely Canada is still lagging. When I'm looking at Canada compared to, for example, California, that already has above 20% EV sales, and their charging stations, I think we're probably 30 to 40% behind that number relative to the number of EVs that we have. And the goal is to have many more EVs in Canada. So currently there's two things. One is it's divided between, right, you have Quebec and BC, which are already close to the 20% or even more. And then you have Ontario, which is much lower than 10%. So different provinces have different strategies and are in different places. And then you have the charging in the different places. I would say we're lagging everywhere, and that's definitely a big issue. And it does go to the investment and the support of the government. Right. Not necessarily government doing everything, but supporting private entities to do that.
Good. So let's dig into Norway, because I know you've written an entire paper with some colleagues on the Norway example. And as you say there, at almost 90% of vehicles are now EVs, and I think that is world leading. So committing to it, doing it is one thing. Obviously, Norway has, a very, very rich sovereign wealth fund, so they've got the resources. But nonetheless, they put in place some very specific policy incentives to make it happen. And what were those policy incentives?
One of the things that Norway has done really well is, regardless of the government that was in charge, they continue with this policy that is supporting EVs, right? So you start in the 90s when they started to have different policies around, for example, taxing gasoline cars, while at the same time giving tax rebates or taxing less or even not at all for EVs, as well as parking benefits, as well as letting toll roads. So that was a lot of work on incentives, that basically incentivizing making EVs much more attractive compared to ICE vehicles, and making ICE vehicles less attractive. So gasoline vehicle less attractive. And then there is a charging. So when you look at around 2010 is when they started really investing heavily in charging. And that includes two things. One is financial incentive, and the other one is a legal side. So they really have done a lot about, we didn't talk about it yet, but a big issue is the fact that in most condo buildings, most apartment buildings, you cannot charge your car. Some of them don't have that ability. So some of them is old buildings that it's very, very tough. But even in new buildings, the condo board might decide, we don't want to do it. Yeah. In Norway, they said, we don't care. You're going to have to do it. So they basically passed laws that says you have to let people charge their cars. And that has a huge impact.
And that's pretty heavy sort of top-down state intervention, which in this case, of course, has been very helpful. And a mixture of carrots and sticks, is that correct? Incentivizing the uptake of electric vehicles and obviously taxing the...
Exactly. If you think about it, at the end of the day, most consumers, I would say, we always look at, there is this green consumer segment. And I think I remember doing research, 10, 15 years ago and talking about this green consumer segment. And I don't know that there was a lot of data of how many people we actually have there. I think now it's growing, especially in the younger generation. But at the end of the day, most people buy cars for economic reasons. They look at, my cost. They look at how much I'll have to pay in the gas station, how much the car itself is going to cost me. And even though today, I think it's very clear, even in Canada, that long term, if you buy a car for 5, 6, 7 years, definitely an EV is going to be much more economical. The purchase price is still higher than ICE cars, and that's where people are looking at. In Norway, they made it completely the opposite. It was a very easy decision for consumers.
Right. Good. And of course, the other country that has been very impressive here is China. And I was reading, I guess, just before Christmas, that there was a month where actually the number of electric vehicles sold in China had surpassed the number of internal combustion engine vehicles for the first time. What's China been doing? Is this again a story of heavy sort of top-down state intervention?
So as you would estimate from China, it is for sure, but it's actually a very different one. So if you think about Norway has no cars manufactured in Norway. Norway also has a lot of oil that was able to support exporting oil in order to support this green revolution. China is a very different example, and I think we can actually learn a lot from what China did. So China basically invested a lot, gave huge subsidies. So they're basically talking about, I think, $230 billion in subsidies for the last decade or so, in a sense, for different companies. BYD, for example, which is now the biggest manufacturer of EVs, got about $4 billion. There were companies that got much more. So on the first side is investment, a lot of investment in those industries. Not so different than what Canada is actually doing, which is why I'm saying Canada on some level on the supply side is learning well from China. The other side that China has done really well is this vertically integrated supply chain. So it's not just about the building the EVs. Obviously, the number one kind of, component in EVs is the batteries. In China, I mean, look at BYD. They have a vertical control, not just of the EVs, but also of the batteries. Unlike Tesla, for example, who's outsourcing the battery manufacturing. Yeah. And I think Canada has a potential to actually build the entire supply chain. And if you look at the Honda example, I think this is why Honda investment has been a really kind of, interesting investment. The investment is not just in building manufacturing of a plant of EVs. It's also building kind of, a plant for batteries and for kind of, the positive kind of, power and all that. So the cathode kind of, and so on, which is another component going into the battery. So really looking at the entire supply chain, a holistic kind of approach, which I think is really good.
But there's something fascinating about China, because you mentioned BYD. I think most people have now heard of BYD, but you've got companies like Geely and Li Auto and Xiaomi, which used to make computers. They're now making cars. I mean, there's a half a dozen I haven't even mentioned, which I don't even know. I mean, my point is, this is a hugely competitive industry in China, and they now make, you're going to tell me the number, some crazy number of vehicles, far more than pretty much the rest of the world put together. And the risk is that they become so completely dominant through that internal competition within China that they actually become dramatically more efficient and effective than companies in the rest of the world. At the moment, I guess we've already got some very high tariffs protecting the rest of the world. But how does that play out? Because I'm seeing echoes of the 1970s when Japanese car manufacturers eventually kind of took over the world automobile industry. Is something like that going to happen here?
And so I think there is definitely the potential for that. So if you look at, I talked about the numbers. So the last year we had something like 17 million EVs sold kind of, globally, a 25% increase from the year before, which is why I say I am optimistic kind of when you're looking at where things are going. But 11 million of those were in China. And this is quite remarkable. I mean, you mentioned, 40, 50%, whatever number, it's quite clear that they're getting into a situation where kind of getting very close to Norway in much less time than Norway. And with own production, right? So all the production is happening within China. And the other side of it, as you kind of said about, taking over the world. Well, the problem is that there is not enough cars in China, not enough drivers in China to buy cars. And this capacity is much higher, which means they have to find other markets, which is why they're looking to sell cars other places. And the cost is so much lower. And I would say the other side, and you talk about, some of the other companies getting into it, which are more technology type companies. The technology is getting much better also. So if you're looking at the technology, the kind of the car itself, the battery technology is becoming more efficient, and the grid, the car to grid, vehicle to grid technology, it's remarkable kind of,
So if there were no tariffs and BYD were allowed to come to Canada or the US and compete on equal terms, what sort of price would we have to pay for a BYD car?
So in many countries, if you look at the price of BYD car, kind of, with no tax, it could be half the price of what you would pay kind of, other places, right? So they're able to compete with gasoline cars and be even cheaper than gasoline car. Like, I think I saw a number like, $12,000 or something kind of, if you look at a US kind of, a car. And I think it's a challenge, but you also have, they're very kind of, if you look at the variety of cars, it's very much the price is dependent on the quality and what you're looking for. There is the issue of the range. For example, if you compare the range of a Tesla, and overall in the US, there is a preference for having cars that having higher range. Range anxiety play a big role. In China, not as much. So in China, they have, in a sense, kind of, cars, their battery is a different battery that is a kind of more efficient, but also have a lower range.
Right. And I read that the charging time for the latest BYD car is dramatically reduced.
It is. So there's both fast charging, and when the battery doesn't have to kind of, it doesn't go for as long of a range, it's going to charge faster.
So it is fascinating to see how this plays out. But I want to go back to your own specific research now and talk a little bit about policies. I mean, you've got an academic paper, Transition to Green Products, Emission-Based versus Product-Based, where you talk about two different types of policy incentives. So just talk briefly about what those two types of incentives are and what your research shows about their relative efficacy.
Yeah, so if you look overall at the categories, I mean, there is always a big discussion about, who should you tax or who should you give incentives to, the manufacturers or the kind of, the consumers. And there is, by the way, it sometimes aligns with where are the biggest kind of emissions, where the biggest environmental impact is happening, manufacturing state or use stage. But that's been a big discussion, and I've done some work, kind of some research on that one. But when you look at the type of kind of, taxes you can either have emission-based taxation, which again could be either on the kind of manufacturer or the consumer. And what that means is that I'm looking at the overall emissions of the vehicle, or in this case, or of any product, from the beginning to end, right, kind of cradle to grave. So I'm looking at big picture, manufacturing side, kind of stage, use stage, and end of life stage. And I'm saying you have to pay a tax based on those emissions. Yep. Now, if you compare that to the other side, which is what we call product-based taxation, it's more of a carrots and stick. It's basically saying, I'm going to divide kind of different products into categories, saying these are good ones, these are bad ones. In our case, these are ICE vehicles, and then I have kind of, EVs. Right. In the middle, for example, I have hybrids, which I might say, you know what, hybrids are okay. I'm not going to tax them. I'm not going to give you a rebate for them, but they're actually quite efficient. They're quite good. But what I'm doing is I'm either giving a big tax on really bad kind of, polluting vehicles, or I'm giving a rebate for vehicles that are good ones. And what we find is that it's a different kind of result. So depending on the emission kind of level of the product and of the taxes, there are some benefits for emission-based versus kind of, product-based. Right. However, if you look at rebates, so rebates is usually almost always is product-based. So that's kind of the idea that in Canada, we used to have a $5,000 kind of, there was a list, which cars are part of it, which are EVs. The US is the same, in Europe, kind of, many are the same. We decided we picked those kind of, really good cars that we want people to buy, and we gave a rebate for them. Other countries like France kind of, are giving on really bad polluting vehicles. They say, if you're using those vehicles, you're such a bad impact on the environment, we're going to charge you kind of, give you a tax on it. So that's kind of the idea.
So is there a simple policy prescription? I realize it's complicated and it depends, but if we can advise the Canadian government on what they need to do next, would you be pushing more on the emission or the product-based?
So I think that the big advantage of the emissions kind of, based policy is the fact that it is very specific. So it's actually looking at the specific product that you're buying, that you're purchasing, and looking at the average emissions, for example, throughout the life cycle of the product, and saying we're going to charge you kind of, something on it. Now, if you think about the product-based, if you're an EV, we're not charging you anything, or we might even give you a rebate, but we're not doing anything. But the truth is, EVs also have emissions. There have been a lot of research originally that said that depending on where the electricity is coming from, EVs could even be worse than ICE cars. I think today there is no question that EVs overall have lower emissions, but there still is some emissions. Right. And the idea is that when you use emission-based taxation, even if you drive an EV, it's going to be taxed in a certain way because we are taking into account the batteries, the recycling of batteries at the end, and so on. So that's the advantage, I think, of emission-based. The problem with it, and this is one of the results that we showed that was quite interesting, if you're too aggressive with taxes in emission-based kind of, policy, you could actually cause the opposite effect of what you want. So what happens is you might cause some firms to kind of, who would have become greener. So we decide, for example, Ford decided I'm actually going to have EVs, not just ICE cars and hybrids. I'm actually going to have EVs. They might decide it's too expensive for us. The taxes are so high. We can't sell those cars in a sense. And there is a fixed cost to build EVs. We're out of the market for the EV kind of, in a sense. And that's going to be the risk in a sense in this type of tax, which doesn't exist kind of, in the other type, the product-based taxation.
Let's turn now to actually the Canadian manufacturing business. And of course, all this is in the context of, challenges in terms of tariffs between the US and Canada. But most people will know, I think, that Volkswagen's got this new battery plant, $14.4 billion in St. Thomas, just down the road from us here. And Honda's got a $15 billion EV hub in Alliston in Ontario. I mean, these are impressive investments. And just give us a little bit of a sense of how they ended up in these two locations, because these are hugely sought after investments. I can only assume significant government incentives were put in place to encourage these companies to put these investments here.
Yeah, so I think the Canadian government, I think we talked at the beginning, I think have done a lot on the supply side. And Canada, I think if we kind of step back for a second, Canada does have a big advantage when it comes to EV. When you look at the entire holistic kind of approach and supply chain for EVs, I mean, we have mining, industry, very successful in specific minerals that you need in order to use for batteries, especially, right? We have the knowledge. So you think about, especially here in Ontario, but also other places, working with the Detroit auto industry for many, many years. So many suppliers as well as manufacturers. So we have a lot of knowledge, a lot of human capital around that. And then if you think about the investment of the government in that kind of area, it makes a lot of sense. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, what China did, which Canada, I think, is followed with those investment, is really investing across the entire supply chain. So it's not just about investing in the manufacturing of EVs, but it's actually thinking about the batteries, thinking about having a vertical control. So Honda is a great example. We had the CEO of Honda in Canada in my class last year, and it was great to hear from him about why they decided. So from their perspective, they thought that there is a potential here in Canada because of this holistic supply chain. Of course, the money from the government helped. But I think that when people say, why do we need to invest, why is the money going there instead of somewhere else? There is always a choice. You have to decide which industries you want to invest. I think that there are definitely going to be a lot of jobs coming out of it. But more long term, I think it can build capabilities for Canada around EVs. And if you think about EVs and green transportation, there's a huge part of the economy, but it's also a huge part of the environmental impact. So CO2 emissions, more than 20% of CO2 emissions come from transportation. Yeah. So to me, that was the right investment. And it's also an investment that can build the skills and the capabilities for Canada to become a player in the global stage.
So, there's a fascinating little tangent here in the context of Trump tariffs, because he's got this slightly crazy notion that we're going to have tariffs on everything, and yet we all know that the supply chain is integrated between Detroit and Ontario in a way that makes it impossible to really pull it apart. His objective is, of course, to get manufacturing plants moving from Canada into the US. Is there any chance that this is actually going to happen? Is there any chance that the Volkswagens and the Hondas will say, you're right, we need to actually move these manufacturing facilities south of the border?
So I actually think the auto industry in the US is going to hurt quite a bit because of those tariffs. If you look at what happened, the consequence in 2018 when he puts the first tariffs on the auto industry during his first term, the auto industry lost a lot of money, billions of dollars in a sense, just from those tariffs. Because what happens is that, supply chain is global. I think at the end of the day, you cannot not have suppliers all over the world. If you can create a local supply chain, that's a big benefit. But still, there are going to be things you have to buy outside of your country. Yeah. And Canada, really, the Canadian-U.S. border, I think we saw it when they were trying to block the U.S. border, during COVID and all those things, right? It was such a lifeblood, I think, of Canada, but also of the U.S. It helps the U.S. Economy tremendously. So saying now, you're just around the corner, but I prefer that you go and get from somewhere else that might be thousands of miles from you, from Detroit, instead of going to the other side, going to going to London, going to around here 2 hours away. You're going to get now your supply chain from thousands of miles from the south of the U.S., for example. It doesn't make sense at all. So to me, the tariffs don't make sense in a lot of ways. There might be specific places where you might say, okay, I'm going to have those tariffs, but the auto industry, I think, is going to suffer. For Canada specifically, I think that actually it creates an opportunity also. I look at the potential for Canada to create better relations with Europe in a sense around selling. You look at Honda. I don't know what the demand for EVs will be also in the U.S. I think California, New York, some of the more liberal states are still going to have good incentives and are going to, people want to buy cars. But in other parts of the U.S., it's going to be much tougher, which means you're going to have to find other markets. And Europe, I think, could be a great market for Canadian cars. And the connection is already there. And if the U.S. continues in that direction, I don't see it good for the U.S. overall.
We can't talk about EVs without talking about Tesla. Okay, so I've been following Tesla's stock price with a certain level of schadenfreude, if you'll excuse my bad German. I think it's about, at the time of talking, 50% down or so from its high earlier last year. What's your take on Tesla's long-term future? Because right now, as we know, BYD is making a more efficient car. Teslas are still cool in some ways, but of course, thanks to Elon Musk, they're also toxic in other ways. Right. So what's your take on Tesla's future? I mean, that's a pretty open-ended question, but I'd love your thoughts.
So I think it's a really interesting. I mean, we were so I think I mentioned to you earlier. I'm doing some work that looking at with the PhD students and a colleague in the U.S. that looks at the political impact in a sense of purchasing EVs. Right. And I think overall there's some really good data that shows that generally the more kind of liberal-leaning people are, they're going to buy EVs, but it actually has a very bad connotation for more conservatives. So even if they see the benefit economically, they might say, I'm not going to buy it because it's a green hoax and so on because of all the political kind of damage. And what's interesting is you have a person like Elon Musk who's in the White House and doing all those things that are kind of very conservative, in addition to some things playing with kind of right wing and so on. That definitely making a lot of people saying, I don't never want to buy this kind of car. So this is a self-imposed injury, of course, which is also very tough then to say. It's very tough to research because usually we want research to be something more general, and this is a very peculiar kind of situation. But if I look at the more general kind of aspect, I mean, Tesla definitely went a very different strategy, right? So you look at the Chinese kind of manufacturers, they said, like China, we need to be the lowest cost in kind of everything. The government invested in subsidies to create economies of scale, and they started with very cheap cars, and now they're increasing the quality. So you look at technology now becoming so much better kind of Chinese cars. Tesla did the opposite. They said, we're going to start with a very luxurious car, build the economies of scale on batteries, and then we can go to the lower kind of level. I think right now we're seeing that Tesla is losing. I mean, the fact that BYD already passed them, and this is just one manufacturer, Tesla used to be alone in the game. Now I think it's going to be very tough. And you can only imagine the Chinese manufacturers be getting better. And also other manufacturers. So, look at Honda producing here in Canada, I believe will be very high quality kind of, EV, as well as other manufacturers. So I think Tesla is definitely in a challenging place, but I think the leadership is just making it more tough. That the fact that, exactly. Even if he comes back after, if he kind of, get kicked out of the White House, like there is rumors and who knows, right? But even in that case, it's going to be very interesting to see what will happen to Tesla. I think it's a very good car. It's very expensive. And when people have to choose, I don't think they ever got to kind of, the middle class kind of, families, which is where a lot of those Chinese kind of, cars are getting. And that's going to be the people who are going to get us from the 20% to the 80%, if you think of the Norway example.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, my take on Tesla is, of course, you can't take away the fact that they revolutionized the industry and that they will always be sort of go down in history for that. But you evaluate Tesla on its fundamentals now. It's a manufacturing company. It's not a tech company. And its share price is still about 10 times higher than it should be if you actually evaluate it
compared to other
fundamentals
manufacturers
of a Volkswagen or a General Motors or a Ford. So it is absolutely a puzzlement to me that it hasn't fallen even further. I'm not predicting they're going out of business. I just cannot believe how much of a bubble there still is around its share price. But look, we must wrap up. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've got two final questions. First of all, if there's one takeaway in terms of Canadian policy towards electric vehicles, what's your advice to either consumers or policymakers or both?
So I think that, we haven't actually talked as much on the infrastructure side. And to me, that's really is the key now. So when I look at what Canada needs to do, as we said, on the supply side, I think Canada already done quite a bit. And I'm more optimistic kind of, on that dimension. On the infrastructure side, I think there are two things, right? One is a public infrastructure. So basically, people are not buying EVs, as we said, a lot of them because of the kind of range anxiety. And that means public charging, which means more incentives kind of, for public charging and more kind of, money funding. But the other side, and I mentioned it about Norway, is actually passing laws that says, and this is like, it doesn't cost money. It actually kind of, has to have the political will to say, you know what, if you're in a condo, building, you have to allow kind of, people. So they kind of the right to charge, they had the low right to charge was in Norway, how they call it. And that's in a sense, I think is going to give a really, because there is a research showing that about 80% of charging is actually happening at home or kind of, in the office. Really, there is not enough kind of, in the work side. People spend 8 hours there. That's the other place where you can really charge your car easily and kind of, and fully. And we don't have enough of that happening across Canada. And partly is really the government giving incentives and passing laws. So to me, that's the kind of two sides that I think really need to do better.
And a final question, briefly, what are you researching next? This is obviously your main area of interest. What is Just give us one new project that you're...
Yeah, so I do. So as part of the grant that we kind of, I got, I'm actually doing a lot of work with colleagues around EVs. So I mentioned kind of the political side. We're looking at second-hand kind of, market for EVs and policies kind of, and should you give incentives kind of, to that? So that's one issue. But in addition, I'm actually looking at other aspects which relate to sustainability kind of, overall between social and environmental sustainability, and looking at the trade-off between the two. For example, in the fashion industry, I'm looking at companies like Shein, also Chinese company, and how kind of, their impact on nature, and what does it mean kind of, and how can we give incentives, and maybe even some of the what's happening now, regulation around the world that is affecting companies like Shein and other fashion companies, for example, in producing in countries and having some really bad social kind of, policies.
Wow. Thank you. Fascinating stuff.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Dialogue with the Dean from Ivey Business School. A big thank you to my guest, Gal Raz, for sharing his time and insights. And of course, thank you for tuning in. On our next episode, I'll be joined by Brandon Chaffelet, Associate Professor, Business Economics and Public Policy, and Director of the Ivey Energy Policy and Management Centre. We'll discuss how Canada is evolving its approach to energy production and consumption, and the importance of establishing grounded and smart policy for the future. Until next time, goodbye.
This was Dialogue with the Dean, an Ivey Impact podcast series. For more insights from Ivey, including thought leadership on critical issues and additional podcast episodes, visit ivyimpact.ca or subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in.